So there's another thing where in the Netherlands there is what I call the large window, small doors phenomenon, when there's a huge sunny window where you can see people's stuff, and the door is, just a regular sized door, but it won't open. Like, you're not invited for dinner. The Dutch tend to be fairly, and I'm generalizing, but that tends to be, we're very organized. There has to be an appointment to come over for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the most wonderful things you can tell another person is, will you stay for dinner? But yeah, there needs to be a space for that.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings, this is Byrne, the Anadromous, coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia, which, if you don't know where that is, you should really look it up on a map. It's not anywhere near Atlanta. Well, I am proud to say we have another episode of our Anadromous Dialogues, and today we're going to be talking with Job from the Netherlands. And I'm specifically not saying his last name because he didn't want me to. and actually, I make that kind of a funny point, as you'll see. We kind of joked about it, but I decided, let's leave Job a mystery to everyone but people who don't know Job. Well, I'm going to introduce you to Job. We had a great discussion. We discussed design, architecture, ornamentation, and time, among other things. And I think you're going to find this interesting. And Job's a great guy to talk to. He has a really great, very Dutch sense of humor, which if you haven't been exposed to it, is a very kind of sly sense of humor. So, without any further ado, Job, where are you?
Okay, so I acknowledge that we are recording, and now we are recording.
Excellent. Okay, well, for those of you who don't know, let me see if I can get this correct. This is Job. Is that close?
You're just doxing me like that, Byrne. You can't do that.
Oh, okay. Sorry. This is just Job.
It's fine. Your pronunciation was so bad, nobody will get it. It's fine.
If you want, I'll put some little like squeaky sound there or something, Job, and then they'll think it's like something really mysterious.
You can make it artsy. It'll work out.
I will do that. That should be fun.
For now, we dig.
Or I could just do it backwards, like Job.
Most Dutch sounds like that to foreigners.
It kind of does, doesn't it? I was teaching someone how to say what most people in America call Gouda. And and I was saying, I was around a Dutch guy. This was when I was at Libri in Switzerland a few years back. And I said, it's really Gouda. And he goes, no, it's
no.
It's just like practically spit the thing out.
Yeah, Gouda.
Yeah. So anyway, Job, for those of you who've been on Paul Vander...
Your audio's dropping out, Byrne.
Is it? Did I just put my...
Is that my mic or my headphones? Did my headphones just suddenly die?
Can you hear me? Odd. Do I sound normal? It could be... Huh?
You're back.
I'm back. Okay. So for those of you who've been watching Paul Vanderklay's channel, you are probably very familiar with Job. He's been on there several times. I've lost count. And but this is the first time. I know I do have some folks that don't make it over to Paul's channel. And Job is a Dutch man, lives in the Netherlands. Nederland. Is that Nederland?
Very good.
And where do you live exactly?
Somewhere around Rotterdam.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, everything is close here.
Right,
I can
right. I
name any
know.
city, and
I used to, when I lived in Alaska, our nearest town in Canada was a 5.5 hour drive.
it's bizarre.
And that,
Country shouldn't be that big. Should be a law against that.
yeah, I know. I think, well, I live in Georgia now, which is probably about the size of Austria. And I figured out we could get 21 Georgias in Alaska. And it's like 300 and some 270 or so in America itself. All so it's just, yeah. But nevertheless, the Netherlands has one of the strongest economies in the world. It's as Hans Rookmaaker once said, we're no third world proposition. With classic blunt humor. But Job kind of started his journey. Tell a little, just give the mini version. Don't go on for hours here, but just the mini version of your journey from when you discovered, just a little bit of your journey to wherever we are now, but make it under 5 minutes or so.
Boy, Job's journey under 5 minutes. I will do my best. Yeah. Okay, so the Cliff's Notes is, person has history of depression, person runs into Peterson, life changes, and it's called, the Peterson Peugeot Venne pipeline, that sort of stuff for Vaki usually hits in there. And I ended up after some zigzagging, eventually converting to Christianity, although I sometimes feel that that's still a work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
And is that under 5 minutes? I think that works.
That was like under a minute. So yeah, no, Rookmaaker always said he was converted in a prisoner of war camp in World War II, and he always said that I'm still shocked every time I go into a church. And part of it is he couldn't believe how bad the music was. He couldn't believe the kind of lackadaisical attitude of everything. And but he was a great fan of Black American gospel music, and of course he was connected with Labrie and all of that. But so Job and I finally met up. We'd never really had much connection, but we finally met up at Landau at the Bridges of Meaning Festival there, and I thought it would be just interesting to talk. Turns out we kind of have a mutual interest in things like texture and design and such like that. And you're coming at it more from a computer. Am I right in saying you're coming at it more from a computer-based idea? Or technically I work in inclusive design. So I'm an inclusive design consultant. I get hired by companies who want to, for instance, develop an accessible app, and by accessible it can be used by the blind, the deaf, people with limited motoric dexterity. If my English is slow, I was at a fire since 4 a.m. So for whoever's listening this later, we had to delay our meeting here. We mentioned this before we started recording because he was firefighting. Go ahead.
It's just life. What was I talking about? Help me, Byrne. I lost the thread.
Design, motoric.
Right. Thank you. So depending on apps and websites, but my current employer or current client does that mainly for museums. So then the whole tactile accessibility of, hey, how do we, for instance, make the latest photos of the Hubble Space Telescope in a different way accessible? How do we convey an idea or a feeling or an aesthetic in a different how would you say that?
Sensory experience?
Perception. So in that sense, I was interested in what you had to say on texture, uh, I like how you also connect things to puppetry. You actually introduced me to Rookmaaker. I had never heard of the guy before. See, that's so interesting. I don't think the guy is known in this country at all. And
Yeah, yeah,
like you had CW on a while ago,
yeah.
and he introduced me to Doivit, who I'd never heard of.
You really haven't. That's really funny.
And I asked theologians, like, have you heard of Doivit? And like, yeah, we heard about him at university or something, but he's hardly known.
Yeah, yeah. But I think he's very important. Well, maybe you're right that the influence of both of those have been felt more in America in many
Mm.
ways. And yeah, I do have a video on Dutch Christian philosophy, which I don't know if you found that one, but might,
No,
yeah.
I'm still discovering like your side channels, and there were some new videos I was watching by you that I thought were really interesting. But I see, I really wanted to prepare for this talk a lot better, and I've been able to, and stuff has been on fire.
It's all right. It's
So,
all right.
but I rewatched your video on conceptual humanity, which I think is one of the more interesting ones you've made.
Yeah, and
Please
I
don't take
did
it as
that.
an insult. I think it's a very good video.
I did that as a lecture at L'Abri in Switzerland in 2016. So that's been a while now. And at that time, if you went all the way through the end,
I've lost audio, so that probably means my internet connection is unstable.
or it could mean mine is.
That was the cause last time. I think that's just my internet connection. That suddenly I can't hear you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there you are again. Yeah, that must be my internet connection.
Oh, or it could be mine because I'm not wearing earplugs.
Anyway, we'll cut this in post or leave it in, whatever. So yeah, there were a bunch of things I wondered what you think about. I tried to I introduced you to Christopher Alexander, and I kind of wonder how you've been going through his ideas, because I figure you've been reading some online works by him or watched some videos. How'd that go?
Yeah, I've discovered him through you actually, and I've been listening to speeches and from different periods, and I'm still trying to. I really think his ideas are very important, and so I'm looking forward to it. I've been in a mode. I suddenly had this idea about, I think it was last year, maybe about 8 months ago or so, when I suddenly realized I've been really fascinated by ornamentation in Georgia, by the fact that everything traditionally here had always had some sort of extra design to it. And even during the communist period, which one would have thought had gotten very flat and more modernistic, there were still elements that I find more engaging, like Stalinist Gothic. And even today, I was walking down the street and I saw what I would consider a fairly bad, I don't know, 6-story building. And yet I looked at it and I saw it still had these, what is it, the balconies and the way the fences were on it were still quite interesting to me, and it almost seemed like it was decaying in a very interesting manner, and even though it wasn't that old. So and then there's a period where it all stops here and you just get the flat lines and squares and such. And I was wondering, like, how did this happen? I know about the international style, and I know about postmodern architecture, and I know, a bit of the run-up of the history of Bauhaus and all of that. But it occurred to me that what I'm looking at isn't coming from those kinds of, more intellectual artistic spaces, that they're coming from just, contractors and city planners. And here, someone will build a building they will tell the city it's going to be 5 stories, and then it ends up being 8 because the rules get kind of pushed around here. So I was thinking about, what's the thing with ornamentation? And then I've got these big books. I think you found one of them, and you found the Owen Jones one, didn't you?
Yeah.
There's also another big one from the same period by a French version by a guy named Racinet. And both of them do more or less the same thing in a different way. And they were taking advantage of early lithography techniques and printing. And they were essentially creating, this is a little bit around the same time when, for instance, they started making posters very serious, like during the Art Nouveau period. And they were both taking advantage of the color plates now allowed to them for printing through lithography. And so what they're doing is showing, I think Owen Jones shows more countries around the world, if I remember. I got them both around the same time, so they tend to be all one huge book to me. But they show this, that every society and civilization has had ornamentation. And then I said to myself, well, where did it go? How come we don't? And it's clear to me that this is a feature of classic modernism, because you start getting the buildings. But even if you look at buildings from the 1930s, you still have, the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building still have these design features that would be called ornamentation in some way that are coming from Art Deco, which is maybe the last style that would include ornamentation in a building. And I was in Prague earlier this year, and I was going around, I was seeing buildings that were, there was a Cubist house there that was really fascinating. And and I often would think, now the Cubist house isn't exactly like Picasso's Cubism, but a lot of it is based on squares and things like that. And there's a really great restaurant there, which I highly recommend getting there. Eggs Benedict there. But there's a sense of design to it. That is to say, it's not just, and I think somewhere along the line we moved into purely, it's the form follows function mantra.
Yes.
Yeah. And
one of the worst things.
Yeah. And when I lived in New York City, I had friends who were architects, and they always just repeat, well, form follows function, form follows function. So go ahead.
There's a lot here. So first off, have you ever seen the Cubist houses in Rotterdam? Have you seen a photo of those?
Maybe not. No.
Okay, you can look them up
Right.
and post a photo in the video when you edit this, because they're quite interesting. So I've been wondering about the same thing. At some point, I was at a accessibility conference in Toronto where I was a speaker, and my wife came along, and we kind of stayed in this sort of Airbnb, but a bit more official via booking.com. And it was in this huge high rise in smack dab in the center of Toronto. And we would go in there, and we had this tiny apartment, and there was a kitchen that was clearly too small to really cook in, with a tiny table that was too small for more than 2 people to sit, and a couch and a TV and a bed and a shower somewhere. But we were both like, these are sad. It's just these huge elevators where everybody just kind of stares and waits till they're at their floor, and nobody knows each other, it seemed, at least. And the entire house was not meant to invite anybody else. So there's another thing where in the Netherlands there is what I call the large window, small doors phenomenon, when there's a huge sunny window where you can see people's stuff, and the door is, just a regular sized door, but it won't open. Like, you're not invited for dinner. The Dutch tend to be fairly, and I'm generalizing, but that tends to be, we're very organized. There has to be an appointment to come over for dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the most wonderful things you can tell another person is, will you stay for dinner? But yeah, there needs to be a space for that. And Alexander would have things to say about that as well. But before I go on a whole tangent, my wife and I, when we first moved to the town, when we did, we were in a like 4-story apartment block. We had a little apartment, and we could look at this other apartment block that was kind of older, and it was torn down, and it was replaced by just basically this square brick thing. No ornaments whatsoever, just straight lines, pure geometric thinking. And we both looked at it like, this is just dead. There's nothing here. And we coined the term Netflix box, which since then I've heard Paul Venekla use. So I've colonized his mind a little bit. But that's what they are, because we would look out in these houses and like, yeah, it's there are people there, but there are no visitors. There's just Netflix and maybe eating there, and that's it.
Right.
And of course, COVID made everything worse. It just intensified that. But I see it with, like, they're tearing down the old hospital and they're building apartment blocks there. It's all the same. It's cubes. They're not what Alexander would call alive.
No.
And that's it's a term that fudges, as Paul would say. And that's maybe, I wonder what you think about that. I think ornamentation is important. I think community is important. These types of things. I'm trying to figure out where the balance is between modernity and nostalgia, and where between there is still that stuff that seems to mesh with what it is to be a human being well.
1 second.
Now, dear listeners, I'm assuming Byrne is grabbing a book that's relevant to our discussion.
I am. This is a book by Adolf Loos, German, and it's a book of essays, and the most important one, is Ornament and Crime. And he seems to be the first person, this was about 1908 or 1909, who suggested there was a real problem with ornamentation. Now, he's not doing it because he doesn't like beauty, but he considers it kind of an economic waste, that a person will spend all this time, for instance, making something, adding something as part of, the leg of a table, or, some sort of embroidery or something like this. But there's no way they can, for instance, if they sell this, that they can actually get the value of the time spent. Now, that's part of what he's saying. He's also looking at the late, I don't know what you call this in the Netherlands, because you don't have Queen Victoria, but in England, they always call this the late Victorian period. I think in France, it's like the bourgeois era or something like this. But it's that period near the end. Well, it's moving into the fin de siècle, the end of the 19th century, the symbolist era, the period where Art Nouveau and the aesthetic movement and all of these things are coming to the fore. And he's actually very critical of many of those things, because he says, these are only things that rich people can afford. So in a sense, he's making a somewhat socialist argument against it, but he's also saying there's no reason that all the things in the house, all the need ornamentation, that they need. He's also looking at the kind of late Victorian design. In California, we had a thing called the gingerbread house, which was, if you've ever seen the movie Psycho, that's an example of a gingerbread house. And what they used to do is sell all of the little gables and all of the little cornices and everything, and they all had their little design. But when you were having your house built, you would go to this yard and pick out all the pieces and put it all together. So it was a way of having Victorian ornamentation, but at that time, a cheaper mode. Now, of course, it would be way too expensive to do that for most people. So what he's complaining about is, that in Europe at that time, they were starting to make buildings where they just had facades or I think, what are they called in America? It's like an iron frame, but where you just only the front of the building had this ornamentation, whereas the rest of it was just a box. And so he was critiquing that. He was critiquing those things, but his ideas essentially led to it was like the first serious injection of the idea that we don't need ornamentation. It's leading to the form follows function of Mies van der Rohe and all of those folks. And so I've been trying to trace this. Why were there still design elements in Art Deco? I don't have the answer to that yet, but I'm looking into it, trying to ask these questions, because it strikes me that ornamentation is a basic human thing. Just as in my lecture on texture, is that texture is a basic thing in life. And why in the early modernist era did it become so important to increasingly cut off the texture and make flat, and here's the really devilish word, to make everything utilitarian. It's just what is useful. And then you start getting stuff like Scandinavian design and things like that, where this is where IKEA, as you call it, IKEA as we call it, becomes really important, because now you have this new, they used to talk about Danish modern and such like this, these new designs. Eventually you start getting ergonomic designs and all these things, but all of them have this tendency to be more and more simplified. What do you think about this kind of stuff?
Well, one thing is, I don't think it's new.
No.
This existed in the Weimar Republic, if I recall. There was a movement that pushed back against mass production, which was then, also already kind of a thing. So a couple of thoughts that might be a bit disjointed, but that pop into my head. What I don't want to do when I think about this stuff is idolize poverty.
No.
But I try to think about, okay, why? I wonder if we are so that we've changed in the sense that we want a lot of stuff. Like if I look at the generations before me, with my grandparents, for instance, they didn't have many things, but the things they had were good. And often the things that you had transmitted through generations. I think the generation before, like my parents, baby boom generation, I myself, I'm 40 now. We grew up in a world of extreme availability of stuff. Like most of our house is full of secondhand stuff. Like, I don't know, an old IKEA bookcase that my mom had laying around. There's little, I don't know, bunch of secondhand books I got from somebody that I still need to read. Here's Groen van Prinsterer. That's a fun name to pronounce.
Yeah, I mentioned him in my Dutch Christian philosophers video.
Yeah. But also, it's on top of some other secondhand stuff. It's available because there's just constant new production. Now it's very easy to go on a rant about, well, everything's the same and everything's cookie cutter. But it also made things available to people who might otherwise not have been able to afford it at a new level. Let me tie a bit in how that deals with my job as a firefighter.
Okay.
Back in the day, when a house was on fire, you could have a bit of time. You could build up your hosing outside, get your masks on, etc., because most of houses were built full of solid oak furniture. Takes a while for it to burn. Isolation was less of a thing, so the walls weren't filled with isolation. Nowadays, everything is glued together, pressed glue, wood mixture inside. Everything is full of isolation stuff. All that stuff, when it reaches a certain heat, starts gassing out, pyrolysis. And what that does is it fills a whole room with this gas. And then the oxygen runs out and the fire dims down. And then we show up and we open the door. Boom. So our training has changed. Like the firefighters before me were trained differently than my generation of firefighters, because we have to deal with the different components within a house, the different way that heating works. Electric cars are a thing, but I digress. This always makes me think of how Peterson will say, we have no idea what the consequences of our actions are. We're still getting used to the fact that we have cars, like that's still changing everything at a massive way. But it almost seems that it's so easy to say something, and what I'm trying to be careful about is that I remain nuanced. It is very easy to say people live in boxes and their boxes are filled with crap, because what's more important is to have the stuff and to have the big TV and not, the other thing that's maybe expensive at a different level, but has a different, it has beauty. It's not a screen that projects stuff into the house. It's very easy to have a sort of naive, we must return to that time idea. But on the other hand, I do think it's significant. And if you are in a house where it's all just the same and all the windows are the same, and it's just everything is filled with this pressed wood cookie cutter sameness, I knew somebody, and he had art on his walls that he got from IKEA. It was just this poster from New York somewhere. Like, okay. And I don't know if he hung that up because he actually liked it or because he felt he needed to hang something up. Like, I have a Triceratops behind me. So my grandfather was a painter and he painted it for me. And I loved dinosaurs as a kid. Still do. That never goes away.
So that has a certain kind of meaning for you. And it's also, I assume that's the original painting, so it's repeatable.
Yeah. My grandfather is no longer with us. Yeah.
I think, you may notice over here, there are paintings on the wall. These are all paintings I've found since I've been here. A lot of them at this place called the Dry Bridge, which was a large, I don't know what you call them, and we call them yard sales or flea markets or garage sales or whatever. But all of them are like that. Some of them are quite interesting. But the interesting thing about all of them is they're actual paintings, and I didn't spend that much money for them. And I think the idea of having things on your wall that are not repeatable is important. Also, eventually, this room is not going to be white anymore. I'm right now in another room. I've just peeled off all this really terrible wallpaper, this plastic wallpaper, and I'm going to completely repaint it. And I'll eventually show what I'm doing on a video sometime, but repaint the whole thing the way I want to see it, which will be probably very different than anyone else can possibly imagine right now. And I've already experimented with these ideas and textures and such like that. On this side, you will notice, I'm seeing myself in different, okay. On this side, you will notice that I have bookshelves, and there's about 3 meters worth of them going on each way, and they go up about 3 meters almost. And I just built those. But
I wondered, I was going to say, because they fit really well.
Yeah, well, I bought the wood, and the wood here was so expensive. And I've been looking for furniture here because, I'm slowly moving in officially. Eventually, I want to bring all my stuff from Alaska here, hopefully next year. And but finding anything resembling quality furniture is so difficult here. And because so much of it is this pressed muck stuff. And you go and you look, oh, that's a wood table. And you go on the side and then you realize, no, that's not. It's really clever. It's even got grain in it. But then you look and you realize, that was pressed into it.
So here's a question for you that I think is significant. Those bookcases, do you intend in your lifetime to replace them?
No. And I have to get lots more. Eventually that wall will be all bookcases too. And so will another whole room here will be nothing but bookcases. I have no intention. I had to spend extra money, and then I stained them and cut all the wood. I have to spend extra money to make those because wood is so expensive here. But I also don't ever expect to get another one.
So here's the thing. Because I think that's exactly right. But because the way a Netflix box is constructed, it breeds transience.
Oh, yeah. Well, I also think it's the white walls. And here, listen to what I'm saying here. I used to work in New York City in the art world. And when you would go into any gallery in New York, you would see the same things. White box, blonde wood floor, and then usually each wall would hold one painting. Now, if you remember from photos, and maybe you've actually seen someplace in Europe that is actually still like this, the older halls for exhibitions you'd walk in and there'd be like painting, whole wall full of paintings.
Yeah.
Some museums are kind of like that still, certain rooms in the Louvre and such. But that was, obviously that was getting tiring to people. So they shifted to the new model sometime in the early 20th century. But then the houses began to look like that as well. So you ended up with, like, in America, everyone's kind of walks into a place, oh, it's so much light here. And meanwhile, they've also got a window that's massive windows. And my thought is, well, maybe though, if it was a different color. See, the older buildings in the Netherlands are all very dark inside. You have a lot of darker wood and such like that. And one of the qualities I know that the Dutch people like are the quality of coziness, of feeling.
Gezellig.
Yeah. And that's a feeling that you don't get in a lot of newer homes, particularly in America, where the spatial configuration. I have some friends, lovely friends. They have what should we say, 30-foot high, 10-meter tall window, a set of windows in one room, which is like, and granted, it overlooks an Alaskan scene. It's pretty spectacular, but you can't really get any more of a view of it for the top half of that than you get from the bottom. That is to say, there's no stairs up there to, so why? And the idea is they want more light in the house, but at the same time, it provides a kind of a sterility to the textures of the house because it's so overwhelming. I mean, it has such a massive effect. And I wonder about our use of materials like glass, which obviously glass is a great material as far as materials go. It's certainly ecologically better than plastic. But I think about these buildings that we build, these days, so many of the new modern buildings, the 21st century buildings, are glass and steel and maybe a cement structure. And I wonder, what does this all mean to us? What does it do to us? And what you call the Netflix box, which is a great, I think I'll use that myself if you don't mind, but because that is what people do. And if you know what Netflix and chill means,
yeah,
it means sex. Why don't you come over for some Netflix and chill? This is the world we're living in now. It's just a screen and a boring box. Whereas I find what's interesting is when I've been in places like you have wood on your ceiling. If you just are in a bed and kind of looking up, our eyes naturally gravitate towards the textures of the wood, the grain. We start looking at it, but you know what? Each of those rafters, none of them is similar to the other. That is, they're all wood, obviously, but the textures are all different from each other. And I think that's what we need to feed on. I think ornamentation was the human response to the natural textures. And people made textures related to the environments they lived in. That is, you would use the kinds of materials for instance, one thing I realized, and I have a whole video of this on my Georgian Crossroads channel, is that the art and the architecture here are primarily influenced by grapevines. Because grapevines are what is almost eternal. They're, people here invented fermentation of alcohol or discovered it about 8,000 years ago in this country. This is the first place we know of. So the grape And the vine is, and in fact, their word for the vine and the grape is the same. It has a specific way of when a grapevine puts new shoots out, it sends out little curlicues, these little small things. And you look around and you see, oh, all the traditional architecture here has some form of the curlicue, of this little thing that spins around. And every culture traditionally, before you get too much modern global connection going on, traditionally has had some connection to that, what is in their world. So, you know, the way in Alaska where I live, the natives would build long houses. Well, they were made because we have very big trees, and they would also, by living all being together in one big house, they would stay warmer. They could put a fire in the middle of it, which would function a bit as both a heater and a place for cooking, and they'd have something on top to let the smoke escape. And also because they had time in the winter, because they had so much salmon swimming up the streams, that they would carve. And their carving is absolutely amazing, and it's its whole aesthetic. You know, Pacific Northwest carving by natives is a whole thing, and it's completely related to the outside world. But it's also their specific vision, which is very geometric in many ways. And so I think that it is natural for people to come up with this. But now we have a place where, for instance, we're not actually getting Swedish furniture. We're actually getting furniture from Vietnam or China.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons, for instance, Georgia here, which is a fairly poor country as countries go, can afford new furniture is because they can buy the Chinese imitations. And the Chinese imitations of all sorts of things are designed for two purposes: one, utilitarian, and two, most importantly, inexpensiveness, so that these things all break relatively quickly. And I think there is something between modernist design, utilitarianism, and economic greed or necessity, depending on which way you look at it, that is where we're stuck right now in at least new building. Certainly here in Georgia, but in America, I know it's very much the same. And the answer seems to be, for instance, how to reclaim. For instance, one of the reasons I'm going through this elaborate tearing down of the wallpaper, and I got permission from the person who owns the building to do it, is because I'm reclaiming it from the cheap plastic wallpaper, which is put on there because, I mean, it's just cheap Chinese plastic wallpaper. It has no meaning to me. It has a modicum of texture, but no actual color to it. And I just want to hide it. I want something that reflects more of, I try to make something that when a person walks into the room, as you said, you want to invite people in. And so, for instance, the fact that I put this up here, suddenly that is an amazing conversation piece, and it is much more powerful as a conversation piece than, where am I going? I'm looking the wrong way always, than the screen.
Oh yeah, that hardly, because you have to point it out. I hadn't even seen that because I've mostly been looking at the art on your wall and the bookcase. So here's a couple of things that I thought of when you were describing all this. There is a writers' guild in Tbilisi. Have you been there?
Building?
There's a building that was called the Writers Guild building.
I may have. It's okay. I'll have to look for it see if I have, because sometimes it has multiple functions. There
is a mosaic floor in there. I only know this because I looked for beautiful buildings in Georgia, kind of in preparing for the conversation we'd have. There's beautiful mosaics there. Like, part of my job is sometimes I have to describe a picture for blind or low vision people. Like, try to describe a mosaic like that. And it's not just, oh, it's a mosaic and it, like there's a fish. There isn't a fish on there, but let's say there was. that's not even like, well, but why? What does it really mean? And then it gets all, then it gets all Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Husserl, and what is it really? What is the mosaic? But I'm not saying, oh, people should have mosaics, because not everybody can afford that. But if you come into our, I don't know, this is a pretty cheap house, but it was built in 1927. And if you come into our kitchen, there's like, the kitchen's green. I should have sent you a photo. Part of the ceiling has wood nailed against it that used to be what's under on the roof of a house, under the roof tiles.
Yes.
And then somebody else had made a floor out of it, and they got rid of it, and then I bought it from them secondhand, and I nailed it against my ceiling. Because the way the house is constructed, and we made a little shelf, and the shelf has all sorts of crap on there, like cookie tins and weird soda cans my wife liked. But also the kitchen backsplash has tiles on it, but they're not really tiles. My wife painted those, and it just looks like tiles.
Nice.
Because, well, and we didn't want to deal with tiles. But people come in the kitchen, and most of it's just a large dinner table and the baby pen, because we have a 1.5-year-old. And oh, it's so cozy. Like, yeah, but that's effort to make something cozy. But we want to be in a cozy room, because the kitchen is where we eat, where we're together. And I eating in a room that's all white. It's just,
I've done
and
it.
again, but it's easy to be really romantic about it, like, oh, beauty, like, yeah, but there is something there,
and it takes effort.
And the fact that people say, oh, this is so cozy, like, yeah, that's because you're not used to it.
Right.
Like, why is this a surprise? I mean, if I go to the secondhand store, there's so many, like, little rugs, like these Persian rugs, even if they're imitation rugs, sometimes they're just campy, but maybe they fit somewhere, And again, the transience of the Netflix boxes, the not having their own, like those bookcases you built, that was work, that was thinking about it, that was like, I have all these books, where am I going to store them? Like, I kind of need to do something with all these books.
Right.
This room is a work in progress.
Yeah, exactly.
But okay, I think the question is, if you have money and you don't spend it on making things beautiful, well, maybe you can't. Maybe you have a family to feed. Maybe you don't have a very high income. It's very easy to be judgmental about, oh, those people have no taste. But you could get secondhand stuff for pretty cheap and make stuff look good, or do something with paint.
And I tell people, if you buy books, if you can get a used copy of a hardback book, as opposed to just the paperback copy. And if you take off the dust jacket and put it on your wall, it adds this interesting cloth texture, which is what I've done quite a bit. And I'm always thinking about the texture of things. And I think part of the reason, as I mentioned in my lecture, that this is a subject for me is because this has crept up on us. No one's really noticed it. I mean, I went looking for books on texture, and I couldn't find any, except for two areas where people deal with texture more. One was in clothing, fabric, and the other was people trying to imitate clothing or textures in CGI. Wanting to create more of a realistic sense of texture in a video game, or for digital effects in a movie.
Haptic feedback.
Yeah. So it's interesting. And of course, they've gotten very good at certain digital effects. And part of it, I was just actually listening to someone discussing this morning. There's actually a really big problem with digital effects. And if you've ever watched one of the heavy digital effects laden, say, superhero movies or Lord of the Rings or something like that, you realize that the credit sequence goes on for like 8 minutes or 10 minutes or longer. And most of that are all of the different effects companies and digital companies. And they were saying in the Lord of the Rings, the Peter Jackson version, they had something like 4 or 5 companies involved. Nowadays, for a big Marvel movie, it'll be like 14 companies involved in creating the digital effects. And of course, the secret to all these effects is widening, working on smaller and smaller levels, because we don't notice, if you're working from, with a low resolution image, it's hard to get texture. So you have to make it the deepest resolution you can, work on it in the middle. This is the same with, like, when I work with photos and try to change something, I have to really go into it to change pixels around. And then when you back up, you don't notice it. And it says, oh, I fixed that photo. I reconstructed, or I did something to it that was wrong. And it's the same with, and much more so in digital effects. So this requires tremendous power, tremendous amount of people all working on these things, because any one of these people, there's nobody who can make these images. There's no single person, there's no single company anymore. It used to be Industrial Light and Magic when George Lucas made the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah.
But now we want this reality. And so the only way to go into it is almost to go on a microscopic scale to deal with things and then come back out for the movie. And it makes it feel more real. But we've gotten so good at recognizing things that people can sit there and go, oh, that's bad CGI. We immediately recognize something is off with the textures. So.
Yeah, I find that difficult to, we can do so many beautiful things with these effects these days, where that I would really consider beautiful, because it allows us to express these new things. But it also really creates a distance. I think, again, this can really be one of those points where I feel like I'm pushing at something and I don't. I'm trying to work through things. If you watch a movie, like a superhero movie, like you're saying, Avengers Endgame, something like that, Marvel, total overload on music, image, and there's still a story there, but you kind of feel like you're dragged through the story.
Right.
And if you watch something like Ingmar Bergman, I don't know, what was the one, Seventh Seal, with the knight coming back from the Crusades.
Yeah, Max von Sydow as
the
knight.
Yeah, playing chess with death. That makes no sense if you come from that frame. But there's all these metaphors in there. There's these particular shots that tell a whole story, if you're willing to have that story told to you. And I notice when I watch a movie that doesn't use strong pushing to tell me, make sure that I, as the audience, understand what's going on, that almost seems insulting. Because sometimes I've seen movies where, they're very cleverly showing me this information through dialogue or something that's naturally there, and allow me to come to conclusions. And then the other stuff just seems like shoddy storytelling, where you're trying to overwhelm me with the visual stuff. But I've just watched a series that's kind of a Star Wars side series called The Mandalorian. It's kind of a space western with this armored warrior, and I don't know if you've seen it.
No, I know about it though.
But there's a lot of sand, and there's tons of CGI, and there's some episodes where the CGI was kind of but there's a lot of close compartments, adventure story. Like spoilers ahead, there's one episode where they basically enters a town. The town has a problem. The problem is the dragon. I'm going to take care of the dragon, fix the town, because all the townspeople come together, and the enemy of the townspeople come together, and they work together to fight the dragon. Dragon is dead. City is saved. Hero moves on. There's a whole eschatological storyline there. It was wonderful. Even though, there was this whole dragon, it was CGI, but I loved seeing that because I knew exactly the story that was being told, and it wasn't all that heavy-handed. I don't know. I mean, to pull it back to Christopher Alexander and his patterns in architecture and his quality that cannot be named, And to a degree, it's what I think Peterson did for a lot of people, including probably me, but it seems so long ago, is that he shows us these things and we notice we can look at quote unquote reality. What is reality? You know, that Rookmaaker video. We look at those things suddenly in a different way and like, I didn't know that I thought the way I thought about these things that I looked at, but now I can look at them differently. And now the world is a bit different. And things seem alive in a different way. And Christopher Alexander would say, well, you have these certain patterns and they create this quality that we sort of feel. And that reminds me of when Peterson talks about, well, when everything's aligned, that's when meaning is most strong. And that's a real phenomenological sensation. And that seems to be maybe even more real than suffering. And so...
You probably haven't found my time series yet because it's, takes a few hours to get through. But to me, so much of this relates to time. Meaning relates to time. We live in Western globalized society, which would include Japan and South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, parts of China, parts of India even. We live in a time where we are violating the meaning of time. And that is to say, we live as if time is an enemy. We live as if time is something to overcome. So anything that takes time is a problem for us. And now, especially since we have so much stuff coming straight at us all the time through visual images on screens, we live in a time where, so the effect of time would be, for instance, I think even in science, there's a loss of the effect of time. I think when Copernicus and Galileo and van Leeuwenhoek all were looking at starting to weigh and measure things in the earlier years of modern science, none of these people had a problem with time because they all lived in a world where they just assumed, and because things didn't move quickly yet, they assumed that time, they just kind of lived in time, everything was fine. And so they started weighing and measuring things. Galileo got really interested in pendulums because it gave him a way to measure, I wouldn't say so much time as duration. And there's a difference between, a lot of people confuse time with the clock, where to me, time, following Tarkovsky here, time is personal. And what that means is that, for instance, if you and I go through, well, let's say the last 10 hours, go back 10 hours and think about our experiences with time. Now, I just went through an experience where I interviewed a puppeteer. I went to a museum that was showing his work. I was blown away by it. Fascinating, but I had to get up early. I slept okay. You, however, went to fight a fire. So our perception of how long or short that took or what that meant is radically different from each other. So we could say it was 10 hours. But in fact, your 10 hours and my 10 hours are radically different from each other. The experience is, so is time the duration of 10 hours, or is time the experience within the 10 hours? And I would say it's the experience within the 10 hours. Or look at it another way. And I think science just kind of casually, they were weighing and measuring things. And they casually said, well, you can't weigh and measure God. And so in the Enlightenment, they just kind of politely shoved God over to the side because you can't weigh and measure. And as Rookmaaker says in several places, he says, and he goes, and so nothing happened immediately. But something was going to happen because so God wasn't the only thing. Galileo breaks down, and he's not the only one, breaks down between primary qualities and secondary qualities. And the secondary qualities are things like color and there's all these different feeling-oriented things, perception-oriented things. And he said, those aren't so real because they're dependent on us. And over here, there was solidity, and there was, the different dimensions, and there was number. But slowly, a lot of the history of philosophy has been like, yeah, really, this is kind of dependent on us. And this is kind of dependent on us. And so eventually, all that was left over on the other end of the real things was mathematics, which of course is really ironic because numbers don't exist in the sky anywhere. they all depend on the following question: 2 plus 2, what equals 4, and for how long? You add time back into it, and suddenly everything gets dodgy. How long will 2 apples and 2 apples equal 4 apples, and what will you find in a year? And the fact is, well, they could all rot. One of them could start to disintegrate into the ground and turn into a tree. And then suddenly they will eventually produce many apples. And we can't say how many apples it will be produced because there's too much information there. But meanwhile, modern science went on and became more materialistic. And Rookmaaker makes a great point where he says, like, they have this, just physical reality. But as I've learned to see it, it's like, well, okay, the basic root of everything, going all the way down, if you go to the subatomic particles, is the reality the particles, which have a lot of space within each other? Or is it the fact they're rotating around each other? And what is that? That's a relationship, and they all have a relationship. And here's the weird thing: every atom is different from each other, just the way every human is different, just the way everything, every tree is different. So we don't understand it because it's all a relationship. I mean, to me, this is the genius of Christianity, is that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, but that Logos implies relationship within the Word. Word itself implies relationship because you don't just speak. Even when I'm talking to myself, I'm kind of imagining that I'm interacting somehow with the world around me. And so, but meanwhile, in the modern world, and interestingly enough, physics has kind of come back to the idea that really there are these, there's a few forces that we can't quite reconcile. Well, they're in relationship to each other. And it's rather than finding out exactly how, which I don't think we can fully resolve that. Nevertheless, there's like a science, chaos theory, where you can't, the actual information is so great that you can, for instance, watch water going over a waterfall and it's never the same twice. And yet you don't have a problem saying that's water going over a waterfall, or clouds in the sky, or wood grains in a tree. I think all of nature is like this. So there's this non-repeatability, but we have tried to create repeatability. We have tried to create a world which is dependable in a materialistic way. We've tried to understand reality in a materialistic way. Whereas in fact, it can't be understood that way, not fully, not deeply. And I think this is what Ian McGilchrist is getting to. I think this is what Christopher Alexander is getting to. It's also what Owen Barfield was talking about, all in different ways. There's another guy I would add to your interesting architects list, and this is a French writer many of whose books are in English now, named Paul Virilio. And Paul Virilio died a few years ago. I think it was about 5 years ago. But he started off as an architect and then started writing. He came up with the phrase, the information bomb. And he says that, and he talks a lot about what he calls dromology, which means the study of speed and how speed changes everything. So what is it? Peterson is often talking about, I'm trying to remember, I came up with this thing, but, resolution on a map, and Peterson will say things like, depending on your resolution, will depend on what you understand as the meaning. But I would add to that, adding in time, it depends on the speed with which you pass it. So for instance, if I'm walking down the street, my view of things will be very, very different than if I'm driving down the street. And it'll be very, very different than if I'm flying down the street. So we tend to think one view is the same as another, that the thing is a thing, to quote what Rookmaaker called the greatest poem of the 20th century. But here's where the rubber meets the road, however. So because we live through flying, through communications, through all of these things, trying to cut away the effects of time, which we don't like. It takes too long to do things. It takes too long to travel. It takes too much. Nevertheless, one of the things I've learned traveling back and forth to America is they're still, I don't know, 7,000 miles apart to get to Alaska. It's still, even though it seems like you can just fly there, there's always an effect, a delayed effect, whether it's jet lag or whether it's just having to stand in those ridiculous airports. There's always an effect that it's kind of like, okay, you violated this, and you're going to feel the effect later. And so whether it's the amount of fuel used up by a jet or a cruise ship or something, there's always some sort of effect of time upon these things. But where it really meets the road is, so in human relationships, people just want it's like you have two choices: the image, the space, or the time, the relationship. And many people have chosen the image. And you can see this on Instagram, where people present themselves. So here, this is who I am. I am this photograph. Or, and finally, to get down here, and I'll stop. What is the time element of love? Commitment. It's the ability to say, I am committing myself to being here. And this is the hardest thing for modern people, or postmodern, or whatever we are now. Because they would much rather give their bodies, their emotions, all of this, than to utter the magic words, I love you, and mean I'm going to be there for you. Which is what marriage was all about. It's like saying, not while it's convenient, but I'm committed to being there. And so without adding, I think the point is not to fight time, but to live within time. I think our relationship to God is in time. Our relationship to meaning is in time. Our relationship to truth, love, beauty, all of those things. Not only that, our words themselves are in time. And the book, or the recording, is the beginning of a step towards making those words more visual. And in the end, you have the advertisement and propaganda. And by this time, the word has just become another visual category. So this is a lot, but
I'm working through it.
Yeah, but the main thing is this: time is important. So time relates to texture, because all the things in time grow with a texture. They take a while to develop. Whereas the kind of world we want to make in our utopian vision is a world without texture, where everything is just, this futuristic world where everything is shiny and gleams. And when I lived in New York City and I would see these tall buildings, I would say to myself, they are building these buildings with all this glass. I really used to think this about the World Trade Center. And I said, somebody's going to get that someday because it's so ugly. And I said, but they're really pretending this will never get old. It does not exist in time. These.
Yeah, it's transient. Yeah.
So somehow texture and ornamentation all relate to time. And whereas the category of the smooth somehow is I would say it's our illusion of living outside of time. And Aldous Huxley makes a big point of this in relationship to the psychedelic experience. He says that it's, he asks these questions: what is it about jewelry that we really like? Particularly diamonds. He says, it's the closest we have in the physical world to an eternal object. What is it about gold? It is the closest we have in the metallic world to something that never tarnishes. What is it about fireworks? It is this experience which, again, kind of gives us this light, which makes us think it's eternal. Of course, fireworks are anything but eternal. But nevertheless, for those moments while the fireworks are going off, we're going, ah. And I think smoothness in glass and stainless steel and all of these things are our substitute for God. They're a substitute because they suggest to us the transcendent. But whereas I think the real transcendent is in the relationships. The real relationship to God is not to be found in the stuff, although I think the stuff is really important. And I think we're losing it through the virtual.
Would you relate this to, for instance, something that Paul Van der Klee identifies as the secret sacred self, and the search for that is a search for the inner eternal thing that is non-changing, that always was?
Well, I think we've kind of hit the sacred self as opposed to the secret one. That is to say that we've made the self the final deity, the final boss. We've made the self. And I think if you remember in my lecture or speech at Landau, I said there's 3 periods of time, and unfortunately, I kind of got rushed at the end because I can't talk for an hour. And one of the whole points of this kind of transformation period that we went through from the late 1960s till about, I don't know, we'll just say 2010 to give it an era, has been about more and more the only thing that matters is the self, the identity, the presentation of the self. And as I just said on my recent video on fairy tales, I wonder about all the talk about agency, because I think it is very much related to movies and stars having agents, and they're representing themselves. And I think that the more we talk about agency, the more it proves, just as in the 60s, the more they talked about love, the more this is the thing disappearing we're talking about. Whereas I think if we don't need to talk about it, because I don't talk about love because I have a pretty good idea what love is. It's difficult. I can still show it. It's the same with agency. I'm not particularly worried about my own because obviously I've chosen to come halfway around the world to Georgia, and nobody made that choice for me. Nobody put that idea in my head. So yeah, I've got agency, but I think a lot of people don't, and we're feeling it sliding out from under us. So the secret sacred self, I think, on the other hand, as I said in the lecture on texture is kind of like nutrition. It's like vitamins we need to live in a world where we're surrounded by the texture of stones and trees and deserts and mountains and forests and rivers, and buildings that have a certain kind of texture in relationship to our environment. They're never the same as the natural world, but the best things always seem somehow situated correctly. And I think that we are looking for the thing which provides meaning. Jacques Ellul says we try to build freedom in build that which people are looking for within the cracks of freedom. But he said they're just cracks. They're always just cracks, and they change. So you have to keep your eyes open.
Would you say that, let's say, living in a Netflix box and you're, maybe a 20-something person or couple, that being surrounded by everything screams temporary at you, especially, it's basically living in the book of Ecclesiastes. Yeah. So it's all breath, because there's nothing around you that says, I am lasting.
Right.
Probably also, let's say you're not married. Would you say that these things, because there are things that we want to desperately stay the same, like look at the idea with climate change, like this too is temporary, this is going to change, it's going to change massively probably, but we desperately want to hang on to this idea of makeable stability. I don't know, I mean, so I became a dad, what was that, 14 months ago? And it was unexpected. Given, I'm 40, my wife is 43, so we didn't see that coming. I can totally see I'm temporary. I know I'm temporary. that little guy's temporary too, but it's kind of nice to see us go through in him as well. At the same time, you see this really strong popularity of people figuring out, oh, they submit DNA, and like, oh, this is where you came from. You might not go on, but look, there's a sort of stability of you as a continuation of a line of being. I don't know. I'm just kind of connecting vague things that seem related to me when I hear you speak.
Well, let me ask you this question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you think the relationship, many of the people who care about the environment, sometimes to a very cultish kind of level and seem like just like they're going crazy about it, but even the ones who aren't, people, and at the same time, many of these people also love to be semi-nomadic and travel and to go to new places. And, I'll watch videos by people who spend their whole time getting in a vehicle and traveling to these unusual parts of the world, or even just the notion of travel. But what do you think, since they don't put down roots, how can they actually care for the environment? Do they know the environment if you don't get connected to something?
This is such a difficult question, because I don't know the motivations of these people. There's one thing that sometimes puzzles me, is that often you read people who are concerned about the environment, and because of that, they want to save it, but they also don't want to have kids, because having kids counts as bad for the environment. But I'm thinking, but then for whom are you trying to save it? Because, for the kids you're not going to have. Now, that's a very easy thing to say, because it might be for their family or their cousins or whoever else. So, but I mean, yeah, like, I know my kid's going to have to deal with the effects, likely. I mean, I live below sea level. So, but without getting overly romantic, having a kid seems just worth it at every level. And that doesn't mean, I'm just going on a tangent. I know that it's a very difficult question, Byrne, because I've known digital nomads, although I don't know if I've talked to them about the climate, but I mean, who doesn't talk about that these days? I don't know. I really don't know. It's such a difficult question, because I think to a degree we also feel trapped, that, like, we are foisted in, I want a house. Well, all that's available to you is a Netflix box. Oh, it needs furniture. Well, you can afford IKEA crap, So to a degree, we feel trapped in this world that forces us to live in a certain way. I mean, if you talk to, let's say, 9 out of 10 senior software developers, let's say they're not burnt out, and like, what do you really want to do? Or what's your hobbies? Like, oh, I do woodworking, or I do something that connects me to something that's not abstract Platonic lines of code. And so part of us sort of knows this is wrong, but we also feel trapped in the system that we're sort of forced to participate in, while knowing that, well, this isn't going anywhere. And yeah, I think that also connects to time, because you keep hearing this, we have 10 years, we have 5 years, or, we have so long before this thing happens. You're like, well, the world won't change, not fast enough.
No.
And then you get revolutionary thinking. And
well, also, you're throwing into that you're going to have to make things change. You've got a couple of choices, and one is to turn your government totalitarian. And the other is to overwhelm everyone with the absolute absence of meaning through propaganda, to convince them, but just constantly hit the message button. It's like you're a little, and get everyone to, you just simply make propaganda hate each other even more, because that's what I think is feeding our societal divisions these days, is just the fact that everyone's getting their ideas about the world through propaganda. The propaganda, not so much of the big media, but what Jacques Ellul calls horizontal propaganda, the propaganda we feed to each other. You know, it's just like, did you hear this? You know, it's like as soon as someone says, did you hear this? And I have to monitor this because this is part of what I have set myself to trying to understand and to find answers for. And I think the last person I talked to was Benjamin Boyce, and he said something like, well, isn't every YouTube video you make propaganda? And I said, I hope not, you know, because, and I can see how it can become so, but I try to leave the ends as sloppy as possible. I try not to say, you have to do this. I try to leave room for, well, human agency, the individual to choose to do something, knowing that, on the other hand, the commercial, political, economic establishments and entertainment, you know, the media entertainment complex is surrounding us like vultures, just trying to get the last stuff out of us, whatever it is, whatever they want, or get us to move. Was that a nice image I painted? So I think that I don't have hope for society, but I have hope for individuals. And I think as individuals, you know, if I can bring someone into my house and have one other, two other, or a few other people say, oh, this is really interesting what you've done. And not just on a, oh, how nice kind of way, but in the sort of way that it inspires them to make something which is harder to understand. Because I think what we need is, you know, there are some banks in America that have these little metal like knives, but you go over them, and if you try to go out through them, they shred your tire shredders. So they just and I think that in a sense, I look at it makes it more difficult to go backwards. But at the same time, my feeling is when I want you to have information that is not so efficient, that is not quick. So I often tell people, well, Wikipedia is a good place to start. It's a hell of a place to end with your knowledge. It might give you ideas, but in the end, if that's your knowledge, you don't know anything. And you have to admit that to yourself in order to use it. That it's a nice place to get your toe wet and think, oh, okay, I should look this up. But at the same time, it's quite clearly, the editing staff clearly has a point of view. And it's not the kind of point of view that always, I find, to correspond with reality. So, but that's why I have all sorts of books by all sorts of people. You know, and I find books, it's a slower means of taking knowledge in. But once you've got it, it's like you can't get rid of it. You've got a tire shredder there that prevents you from pretending like you don't know this stuff anymore. Because you spent time working on knowing it. And that time, you're forming a relationship with the author. You're forming a relationship with the world around you, because most people who write good books, fiction or nonfiction, have observed something that took them time to learn. And you are privileged enough to be able to get something from them. I would never know what it meant to float down the river, the Mississippi River, on a raft if I didn't read Huckleberry Finn. And that's something I'll never be able to do. But Mark Twain understood these things very well. And so as I read it and spend the time to read it and really think about what that means, that little bit of time, comparatively to the amount of time he spent on the Mississippi River, which was, he worked there for a long time, comes into me. But if I just see something that's just a quick reduction of this kind of thing, a 10-minute cartoon, not that anyone would make a 10-minute cartoon of Huckleberry Finn, because now it's politically incorrect because of the language he uses. But I think that we can do something. I just think nothing we can do is quick. And so I think we have to more and more have this mentality that, what is the old thing? Martin Luther somehow was asked if he knew Christ was coming, what would he do the next day? He'd go like, plant a tree. And I think that's the attitude we have to have, because I get all sorts of people who are saying, "Sir, you can stop using PayPal because PayPal has some issues." And I'm going, "No, I'm not. I don't just quickly change my mind because the propaganda one day all says this." I would rather, if I want to exercise my individual rights, then I will take the time to listen.
Thinking through what you said. You must have read McLuhan, right?
Yep.
I lost you there. Okay. Sorry. Did you say yes or no to that?
Yes.
Okay, you did. Yeah. Because the things you say remind me of him. You said something about Wikipedia. Wikipedia is also the changes and everything. So here's the thing. It's very easy to say, oh, the internet was a mistake. Connecting everybody to everybody was a huge mistake. We shouldn't have done that. There's this idea called Eternal September, where everybody got on the web and this culture of hacker culture disappeared. But then we got Wikipedia, but we also got Wikipedia. And again, it all screams transience. Everything does. It's all temporary. It's just Ecclesiastes all over again. But then what does he say? And that's what you say. Well, relate to others, to God, to the wife you love, to your family, to, and you could say, oh, that's just, that's you're just advocating for live, laugh, love. Like, I don't think it's that surface level. I think it's trying to, and we come back to time, what you spend your limited attention on. I am guilty of the same stuff, by the way. I work in tech, I have phones, I've got all that stuff. It's that stupid meme of, the guy who says, oh, we should improve society somewhat. And then this other guy's like, oh, but you participate in society, don't you? And not the point. I don't know how long we have, by the way. I probably have about 15 minutes myself before I do really have to get to a meeting.
Yeah. We'll cut this off in around 5 or 10.
Yeah. One thing I want to get back into with the web, I think the web and computers in general have changed the way we look at time and we look at temporality, transience again. So I work in accessibility, as I've said. There is a big thing in there called the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They're like 22 years old, and they're basically rules to build for the web. A clear heading structure, semantic elements. You make sure there's proper contrast. You make sure that when there's animation, people can turn it off. There's no auto-playing video, blah, 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 blah. The 4 principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, POUR, or poor decision making. Anyway, so often, because I tell people the contrast isn't right here, there's no clear heading structure here. It's all about how can we make this understandable, and you try to work with the designer, with the client at hand. So often there is the response, accessibility or inclusive design makes things the same. It makes things boring. It removes creativity. And I always feel that that's a limited way of thinking, because there's plenty of stuff you can do within these constraints. You can have all sorts of aesthetic beauty in a website or an app that's completely accessible. It just takes more effort. But yeah, we don't have time for that. Yeah, because everything's temporary. Your website's going to have a redesign, in a couple of years. Just like, you bought a new couch because you were bored of the color. It was no longer a fashion. Like we bought a 30 € secondhand couch. And so those couches you can just drop yourself on, and
yeah.
It's like I don't intend to replace that thing, like unless like there's a problem with it. But
well, taking time into account in our aesthetic choices would mean precisely that we do things that last, that aren't boring, but rather are continually engaging, even if you don't engage with them all the time. But you can look back at your Triceratops, and for you, there's a certain amount of meaning coming through that because of time, because of the time it took, the time of the relationship involved, and the fact that you still have it and the time that you have. And a lot of time you won't see that. You're just doing your work. And then every now and then you'll stop, look at it, and the relationship continues in time. And I think that's how, that's why I recommend people don't get those cheap mass market paperbacks, which in America, the book falls apart after a reading or so, or looks really, because that's just garbage. So why buy garbage? If you think it's a valuable book and you want to spend your time on it, then buy at least a used hardback copy or something, or wait until they're used hardback copies, and get something that will last. But it's the same with everything. If we live in a world where everything is transient, I think if I hear you correctly, it's like temporarily, says the preacher. Everything is temporary, and that's in a way the way people live now. Because we have seen things spin over and over quickly, so that the culture of every 5 years seems to go through these changes, particularly for younger people. But I think what they are starving for, like nutrition, they're not getting the right vitamins of meaning, so that they're getting spiritual rickets or spiritual diabetes in their aesthetic choices and such. So they'll have big-eyed avatars that say that they're cute, which is what I'm going to get to eventually on my cute and the creepy series. But I think once you include time back in, it's the time you commit to relationships to realize that people are more important than things. But part of realizing that people are more important than things is when they come over to your house, it's an interesting place for them to be and feel at home. And that takes time to create such a place. A person doesn't have to go out and, this is not an IKEA, Jysk table. But it's another Scandinavian thing. And I didn't get the best one. I got the one that looked like it was made out of wood. Not the most expensive one, but the one that just felt kind of homey and that I would just keep using it. Eventually it'll probably gravitate to just a work table or something. But I think that to think about, that's the reason why when I go look for furniture, I look for wood, is because this will last, real wood. Whereas the fake wood doesn't last. It doesn't hold up. It eventually breaks down, especially some of the pressed muck stuff. It doesn't work. But to live, so you can't afford good stuff, but maybe you can find one good piece.
Exactly.
Yeah. And build, or as Peterson talks about, when he talks about, cleaning your room, he goes, the next place is to make it beautiful. The next thing to do. And he goes, and people are afraid of beauty.
Yes. And it requires effort and thinking. So here's this thing I'm kind of just looking forward to. It's a whole story around it. My grandmother died, I don't know, less than 10 years ago. She was this tiny lady who always worked hard her whole life, and she'd still crush her hand if she shook it, So she had 9 kids. And she would talk in this dialect from the South, and she'd say, kind, gewoon niet zeuren. Child, don't complain. And it was just hardworking Calvinist, nose to the grindstone.
Right.
And when she passed and her house was sold and all her stuff was given away, my mom got a cutting board that my grandmother just always cut the food on and whatever, So it was this round brown wood cutting board, but it's like concave.
From all the use.
From all the use. So she gave it to me, and I said, "Oh, I know," because the outside of our house has this cement round patch where it was patched up, and I'm gonna put that in front of that ugly gray patch, and I'm gonna carve "Don't Complain" in it. And it's gonna be the name of our house.
Right.
Because house should have a name, and I still need to do the carving, and I don't know how to carve.
Right.
But I'm gonna try, and even if I screw up,
Yeah.
So you don't have to buy expensive stuff, but I am such a risk of, and I keep apologizing for sounding like a romantic, but I do think it is more worthwhile to do that sort of stuff. Because otherwise you're in a white kitchen and people come over and there's nothing to talk about because there's nothing there that tells anything about you.
Right.
So then it's like, well,
And
What did you
also,
watch on Netflix?
if whatever you have on your walls is simply repeatable, posters
Mm.
of
Yes.
video games or whatever, there's something about that that's kind of an impoverishment as well. And I'm not saying all those kind of posters are bad, but it should be correlated to what it means to you through time. That is to say, the time you spent with something,
Yes. Yeah. And it's a callback to a different time. Like that was from my grandmother. She lived like this. She was like that. She got this old. Yeah.
Right.
No, I think you're spot on. Yeah.
And there is a formula here, is that the things that, for instance, let's say someone had really bad taste, put really bad posters on the wall, and it just kind of left them there. And then something happened to them and they died or disappeared. And then you came back to that place 50 years later. You would go like, wow, because the time will have changed the meaning of the things. They will now be illustrations of a time that is now gone.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah. So to me, I'm always thinking, when I start talking to someone, I always say, okay, let's try to push this relationship a little further ahead, and then, let's do this one. And I will generally not be too trying to invite everyone to do all sorts of things, because I know I haven't got personally time to have that many relationships. I'm not super gregarious, although I get along fine in crowds. I'm much more interested in the individual I might meet there that I can take along with me for a while on the road, on my life. And I think that, when I buy things for the house, I tend to buy things, if I can't always, but when I find something in glass, I tend to save the glass, clean it, save the bottle, and then do things like put pasta in here, or seeds, or tea, and then I put this on my walls, and people will come in and notice all my stuff. I don't have a lot of commercial stuff visible on the shelf. It's all in glass, and I do that on purpose, just because I said this presents the object it's more artistic, it's more interesting. Costs nothing to do that, and yet it produces a very interesting result. And it's just putting thought and time. Time adds meaning and weight to things. And so one of the things I've learned is that once you start factoring in time to everything, and quit trying to always save time. Jacques Ellul once says in one of his books, he says, so you save time because a road was built, which is now faster. So what have you done with your time? Did you write a book? Did you paint a painting? Did you learn how to cook better? Did you, in other words, most people just go back to the Netflix box. They haven't done anything with that extra time that they've saved through all of the modern conveniences. So,
yeah.
Well, probably about time we said adios, or as they say in Georgian, droabit, which literally means temporarily. And it just basically means, we're just gone for a little while. We'll meet again. And
tot ziens.
And I'll look forward to talking to you again sometime. I've enjoyed this. So
likewise, thank you.
Okay, so do you say dank? Is that what it is? Dank in
Yeah, I can say dankjewel, which means thank you. I can say tot ziens, which means till we see again, till we see each other. So yeah.
Okay. And go look for my Rookmaaker. It's a Rookmaaker video on Dutch Christian philosophy. It's him talking about how he discovered it.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll watch it.
Have a good day. We're only 2 hours off in time zone, which is rare for me. I often get people who are 9, 10, 11, 12 hours off. I think right now, Paul Vanderklay is 11 hours off from me. So
time is definitely the center of this conversation, it seems.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a good time it was.
Yes, very.
Yeah.
Thank you, Byrne.
Okay, there you have it. Our very curious and interesting conversation with Job from the Netherlands. If you're a person who has just discovered this channel, might I suggest subscribing to the channel. I could use more subscribers. Might I suggest liking this video? That does something to the algorithms and helps people find the channel if you think it's worth finding. What else can you do? Oh, you could share the video, or you could, if you really like this channel, you could donate to the channel, give a little gift, and you can do that through PayPal below. And might I suggest also, if you give above a certain amount, you will get 10 hours worth of audio extras for free, dealing with such subjects as images and an extended version of my noise and music lecture and things like that. So if you're interested, oh yeah, like a 6 or 7 hour discussion of San Francisco in the 1960s. How's that? Was that enough? Well, as you might remember, anadromous is a word meaning swimming against the stream. And that is what I beg you all to do in these times where propaganda carries us downstream. So, swim against the stream. And as the Georgians say here in Georgia, droabit, which means literally temporarily, as in just temporarily. We'll be gone for a while, and then we'll meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.